All right, today we are diving deep into a really intense period of history. We're going to tackle a huge question about the relationship between art, power, and, well, total state control. Let's get right into it.
So this is the big one, the central question for our whole explainer. I mean, think about it. You've got this massive, all-powerful totalitarian state, but you've also got a nation with this incredibly deep, rich artistic heritage. So could creativity actually survive? Or was it just completely stamped out? Let's find out.
The sources are pretty clear on this. Artistic expression during this time was systematically, well, strangled. And this wasn't random. It was a deliberate, calculated project built on a few really powerful pillars of state control.
To really get this, you have to understand that for Stalin, culture wasn't some sideshow. Nope. The changes he forced on the arts were seen as every bit as important, every bit as radical as his famous 5-year plans that completely remade the Soviet economy. We're talking about a total cultural revolution.
And the first and maybe most obvious pillar of this control was the cult of personality they built around Stalin himself. And look, this wasn't just admiration or respect, it was mandatory, almost religious worship that had to be injected into every single piece of art.
I mean, just listen to the language here. This quote from the state newspaper Pravda isn't just praise. "Oh, great educator Stalin." That sounds more like a prayer than a political speech, right? It's the perfect example of the kind of deification that was demanded. And it just keeps going. It's in the poetry, too. This line from Song About Stalin paints him as this benevolent, godlike figure, the source of everything good. If you were an artist, you had to present him this way. There was literally no other choice.
This analogy really nails the sheer scale of it. It wasn't about political loyalty anymore. It was a demand for constant, non-stop, unending praise that just sucked all the air out of the creative room.
Which brings us to the second pillar. It wasn't enough to just praise Stalin. Artists were given an official rulebook they had to follow, a doctrine designed to, in Stalin's own words, engineer the souls of the Soviet people.
And there you have it, straight from the man himself. He didn't see artists and writers as creators exploring the human condition. He saw them as engineers. And their job wasn't to show life as it was, but to build a new type of person totally loyal to the state.
And this was the main tool for that engineering, socialist realism. Now, the name is pretty misleading because it had very little to do with being realistic. The whole point was to paint this picture of a perfect future, a socialist utopia, to get people to work harder for it. It was art as a construction manual for the future.
And that's why this analysis is so sharp. Calling it socialist futurism is perfect because it gets right to the point. The focus was never on the present, with all its problems and struggles. It was always on the glorious, perfect future that was supposedly just around the corner.
So how they enforce all this? Well, it was a whole system. First, all artists were herded into state-run unions. You didn't have a choice. Then, you had political enforcers like Andrei Zhdanov. He was basically Stalin's iron fist, making sure everyone stayed in line. The rules were simple. Criticizing the state was illegal, and all your art had to celebrate the party's goals.
But the control didn't just stop with paintings and poems about the present. The third pillar, this one might be the most chilling of all. They set out to completely rewrite the past. The art of history itself was now under state control.
This slide just lays it out in black and white. On the left, you've got what actually happened. Trotsky was a central figure in the 1917 revolution. On the right, the official history book from 1938, where, surprise, Stalin is suddenly a main character. His mistakes during the Civil War, erased, replaced with heroic fiction. They weren't just controlling the future, they were hijacking the past.
Okay, so it seems pretty bleak, right? Total control, zero freedom. But, and this is a really big but, our source material reveals a fascinating twist in the story. Was there any space left at all for real art?
And here it is. In the middle of all this repression, there was one very surprising exception to the rule. A small pocket where artistic freedom was, amazingly, allowed. The classics.
This is the key distinction. Artists absolutely could not depict the present day with any honesty, but the great artistic works of Russia's past were allowed to thrive.
And this wasn't an accident. The state actually encouraged people to read giants like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. The thinking was that the proletariat, the working class, was just as smart as the old elites and deserved access to these cultural masterpieces.
The main goal here was to boost literacy and raise the whole country's intellectual level.
So what are we left with? We've got two completely opposite realities existing at the same time. Near total control over anything contemporary, but this shocking amount of freedom for art from the past. Let's weigh the evidence and get to a final verdict.
At the end of the day, it all boiled down to this powerful split. If you were an artist in the 1930s, your freedom depended entirely on which timeline you were working with. Simple as that.
So, back to our big question. Was there any freedom of expression? Well, the answer is yes, but it was just a tiny slither. It existed, but it was pushed into this one small corner, celebrating the past, inside a system that was designed to completely control the present and dictate the future.
And this table sums up that nuance perfectly. The great art of the past got a pass, but the art of history, telling the story of your own recent past, that was completely off limits. It was just as controlled and rewritten as any poem praising Stalin.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. The Soviet state tried to use art not as a mirror to reflect society, but as a hammer to shape it. So what happens long-term to a culture when its reflection isn't real? What happens when the mirror is forced to lie?